To kick off this morning, we have a keynote panel moderated by Rhea Siers to my left. Rhea is the senior cybersecurity expert at RANE, Risk Analysis Network and Exchange. One small just note above Angelo Longo's face there, his title, official title, just to be clear, is Chief Information Security Officer, but he's okay playing the Chief Strategy Officer this morning as well. But please join me in welcoming Rhea and this morning's panelists.
Good morning. I think IoT first thing in the morning, I mean, what more can you ask for? I understand those of you who were out late last night are coming up with a country music song about IoT. I'm looking forward to hearing that. This morning we have a really wonderful panel. We had a really good discussion over wine last night, over coffee this morning to recover. And I think you'll hear some interesting things from all of them about how they're dealing with IoT issues in their work. Basically, you know, two of the most important issues about IoT in the workplace now are security and privacy. We hear about it constantly. In order to stay compliant, which is a big issue, especially for some of our customers here who face huge regulatory burdens, you have to create trusted relationships with your customers, and you have to protect and secure your data. And let's note, too, that IoT, we're not just talking about consumer-grade IoT this morning. We're also talking about operational technology as well. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to each briefly introduce ourselves, tell you where we come from, what we do, and we'll go from there. Just briefly, I am now with RANE, but formerly I spent 30 years with the infamous National Security Agency, where I was Deputy Director for Policy. I always like to tell people I have great timing. I retired one month before the Snowden case broke. And since then, I've been teaching both at George Washington and Johns Hopkins, where I teach courses on cyber threats, intelligence, and the Middle East. So, Paul.
Good morning. My name is Paul Novak. I am with A.O. Smith. I have responsibility for a number of things, all the infrastructure, IT operations, as well as IT security. I know there's been comments throughout, at least throughout yesterday, about how can security influence IT and get them to do what they need to do. And I have the luxury of owning most of that myself, so it makes things a little bit easier. A.O. Smith, I don't know if anyone has ever heard of you. You probably have one of our products in your house. We are a water heater and water treatment manufacturer based out of, we're headquartered out of Milwaukee, but we actually, most of our manufacturing and I am down here in Nashville. I know A.O. Smith's interesting history. We're a 145-year-old company, started in, I think, 1874. Started making bicycle frames. They're basically a couple engineers, the Smith family, and they learned how to take steel and fold it into a tube. And so they started making bicycle tubes and then went to making car frames. And the very first car that came off Ford's assembly line was an A.O. Smith car frame. So that's an interesting piece. And then they started to get bigger and bigger with steel tubes, and then decided to get into the water heater manufacturing. And then when World War I started, they were actually the largest bomb manufacturer in the United States because they learned how to make large tubes out of steel. And so they were making lots of bombs for the country. And then what they did is they revolutionized a process with water heaters whereby they would spray the inside with basically glass. And what that did is that allowed us to make water heaters that were made of regular steel and rather not stainless steel, because before that, water heaters basically were for the rich, because they were the only ones who could afford stainless steel. And so this patented process was kind of allowed everyone in the world to have water heaters. So what else was that? I think that's it.
Okay, Angelo.
Good morning. Just sing on. Okay, there you go. Good morning. My name is Angelo Longo. I work for Resorts Casino Hotel. As you can well see, I am not the chief strategy officer, but again, I'll take that promotion. I've been in the IT industry roughly 1989, so somebody do the math. And As such, I've been doing IT security for roughly about 18 years. During that time, I've worked for the likes of ExxonMobil, Symantec, McAfee, and a brief stint at Qualys, but now landing here at lovely Resorts Casino Hotel. Resorts in and of itself is an organization which is the first casino in Atlantic City, if those don't know that. And as such, we have the honor of having the first slot machine. If you'd like to come and see it and make a deposit, we're willing to take those right now. The building we have is, interestingly enough, 140 years old, which makes a very interesting kind of like dovetail into what he just said. We probably have stuff from your company in there, I would imagine. Thomas Edison actually put pen to paper to design our actual electrical grid for the actual hotel. So there's a lot of DC currents to anybody who knows that. As such, right now, I am here to talk about IoT. So I'd love to share with you. I don't have a song though. We did try to compose one last night during our thing, and it's unfortunate. I know the devil went down to Georgia. I'm not going to regale you with that, but suffice to say, if I run off stage, I'll be right back. Go.
Good morning, all. My name is Nashira Layade. I serve as Chief Information Security Officer for Realogy Holdings Corporation. Realogy Holdings Corporation, probably not familiar with the parent company, but more with our brands, Sotheby's, Corcoran, Century 21, Coldwell Banker, et cetera. In addition to the real estate brands, we also are responsible for Relocation, Cardis Corporation, as well as Title Resource Group. About 3 years ago, we bought Zap Labs, which is a tech startup in Silicon Valley. My experience, I've been at Realogy for about 2 years. Prior to that, I had about 12 years in FinServ, and then I did about 5 years at Time Warner, the media company.
Good morning. Let's see. I'm Dave Whipple. I work for Apple Leisure Group. I am the Chief Information Security and Risk Officer at Apple Leisure Group. You might be familiar with Apple. Apple is a conglomeration of 7 companies. One of the companies is called Apple Vacations. You might have taken a vacation with Apple Vacations. We also run 60 4- and 5-star resorts down in Central America and the Caribbean. And don't hate me, but most of my workday is in Cancun. So I fly, I spend 3 or 4 weeks in Cancun. I usually take my wife and 2 little boys that are left at home, and they do cyber school, and they sit at the beach, and they're very happy. And I work during the day, come home to a nice resort. And then when it's really snowy and crappy in Philadelphia, where our home office is, there's always something to do down in Cancun, and that's where I hang out most of my. I'm also the program director of Yeshiva University, their cyber warfare program, cybersecurity program in New York, and it's a master's degree program, and I torture the professors and staff on that, and that's what I do part-time. I'm my part-time. So anyway, that's me.
And if you're interested in David's job, he's not allowed to quit because his wife won't let him.
Yeah.
So just so you know.
I'm not allowed to quit. I've been trying to retire for years. I used to work for Dennis Gilbert, who you saw yesterday, at Exelon, and great, fabulous company, fabulous bosses. But this one, my wife said, if you don't take this job, I will kill you. So.
Yeah, there's no way I could compete with that.
Okay, so we're going to start with, I'll call it a softball. Just tell us briefly some of your issues that you've experienced with IoT, and specifically how you see it impacting your company. It doesn't just have to be privacy issues, obviously. We're going to go in reverse. We're going to start with David.
Okay. So, like most of you, the bane of my existence in the hotel industry and data processing, because we have companies in Europe as well, is GDPR. And how this works out, GDPR, as you know, really, really scrutinizes how we handle information. The first month that I was in the company, I went down to Cancun thinking, hey, I'm going to spend a little time on the beach. And I kind of do wandering. And I wandered around one of the nicest resorts that they had. It was only 3 months old. And I noticed the number of cameras, video cameras they had in the resort. And I started asking questions, and I spent the rest of my time there that week looking at videotapes of people from day one that they store on their servers there in the hotel. And all their building management systems were on the same network as their Wi-Fi network for their customers and for their hotel. And so I thought, well, you know, hey, I have a few skills. I'll go back to my room. And I quickly hacked in through my Wi-Fi into the building management system and started viewing some of the video recordings. And so then I went back. That was the first thing I did is I said, we have to separate these networks. And then I became the data eradication officer. And that is, why do we have this and why are we keeping it? And so in the IoT world, what I do is I try and eliminate the data that we don't need, because I don't need a regulator from GDPR EU coming down saying, okay, what's this and why do you have it? And some of the people that we have are VIPs from Europe and North America. They don't like their faces on video cameras. And if that was to get out in the public, it'd be bad for us.
So my issue is somewhat different. So one of our business units is our own internally owned real estate company, right, with each of the various brands. But the individuals who work for us are not Realogy employees. They are independent sales agents. And so considering the millennials coming in, starting to rent individually on their own, purchase on their own, and their obsession with technology, they are really, really interested in smart homes, right? So my issue is dealing with educating the agent population on the risks related to both privacy and security as they encourage folks to install smart devices in their homes, in their apartment units that they either want to sell or rent. So we have homes, we're advertising them or apartment rentals as being smart. You have no idea who's coming in and out of those homes. Folks, the actual homeowners or home renters, most of them are not technical, don't know how they're setting it up. So we have a whole lot of information flying around that folks can come in, get access to, that because these agents are not my employees, I cannot require them to do A, B, or C. Nor does my company allow me to require them to do A, B, or C. So it's a very interesting challenge that I have regarding IoT, one, to sell and market, but also to control the education of the agents who are dealing with both the sellers, renters, as well as the owners.
So I have some issues with IoT, but my issues are really about implementation in the future. Right now, you guys may have heard of a fish tank being hacked. I'm not sure if anybody heard. That was utilized as a pivot point to the network. That fish tank was a sensor, I believe, and that was just put on with probably default permissions. We fight these battles every day. The reality is, I've found Apple TVs in my network that executives just decided to bring in and plug in. I've found devices that were not appropriately configured. Part of my actual strength to my network is the fact that it's very confusing and very legacy. And as strange as that may seem, that actually helps out in a lot of different ways, because if you're trying to actually get through the network, it actually is more difficult because of the complexity of it. But having said that, in any given situation, I like to go back to the fact that someday I'm going to have to deal with Alexa, somebody going in saying to Alexa, I want to bet $500 on the Eagles to win, and they did, by the way. I'd like to get that in there. But I'm going to have to identify that user. Is it a legal transaction? Was this person allowed to do that? Do they have the money? Those kinds of things. Someday that's going to be an issue, and I like to harken back to that. Infiltration in a network is one thing, but actually user identification through voice or whatever means that external box, whatever is going to do, is an actual problem, because it's the same problem you have if you're just identifying somebody with a username and password. This is just a box that gives a conduit into a system that allows people to actually do something that it is a little more privileged. So there's my issues and what I do.
All right. Well, I'm sure you all have heard of smart homes, and that's the new craze. Everyone seems to have an Ecobee or a Nest or something in their house that is plugged in. Well, water heaters. We've been struggling since I've been at Smith 5 years now, and since I started, we've been struggling with the idea of, okay, do water heaters need to be connected? And right now, we have a technology in place. About 5% of our water heaters are connected devices. And we struggle with, okay, is a consumer really going to want to look on their phone and see what temperature their water is? They're going to want to be able to turn their water up and down. And for the most part, we haven't seen a big uptick on the consumer market. But we are into that space because eventually I think everything's going to go to that. And so, the one thing that we did, luckily the engineering team that was pulling together the IoT architecture, pulled IT, pulled information security in pretty early. And so, we were able to sit down with the vendor that we were using for the platform, talk about, their cloud platform, really do a pretty in-depth review of their security and their technology. We actually helped, or at least ensured that from an encryption standpoint, all the communication that was going from the water heater kind of through the consumer's wireless up to their platform was encrypted. So they actually did the encryption at the chip level, so it wasn't necessarily at a software level. But because of that, we also had to then put controls in place so that if someone did hack in or someone went on their phone and hit the plus button too high, that their water heater didn't get too hot. And so there's both some mechanical safeguards as well as some software safeguards that we have in place so water heaters don't do that. Where we've actually found more, more interest is more at the commercial level. So we build retail or consumer, commercial, everything. We build a lot of big boilers for large hotels and hospitals and things like that. And the building management systems, they are much more interested in what's going on, because if a homeowner's water isn't hot, that's one thing. If a hotel's isn't hot, then that's a bigger issue. And so there's been a much greater uptick from the commercial side where the building management systems want to know exactly what's going on with their water heaters. The other thing that we're doing, and we actually see this as more of a positive thing or more value, is the data that we have. I mean, yesterday we always talked about, everyone's a data company. Well, pretty soon I think we're going to be a water heater data company, because we're gathering terabytes of data about what's happening in water heaters. And we've hired a number of data scientists. We have our engineers looking at that data, trying to determine, are there indicators in the sensors that we have in the water heater that's going to tell you when this is 6 months from failing. Water heaters are different. You set and forget. Every 15 years you replace it. Hopefully you replace it before it breaks, but a lot of people don't. A lot of people just wait till they have a large amount of water sitting in their basement or in their garage, and that's where if we can determine and send something to the consumer to say, hey, listen, by the way, yours is going to fail in 6 months. Buy a new one. We'll think that they'll look pretty positively upon the brand. The other issue we have is we do about $2 billion of work in the U.S. We do about $1 billion in China. And dealing with China is a whole different animal. I was over there a couple weeks ago, and they're trying to get into the IoT space, and not only in the water heaters, but in their filters. And so when filters go bad, they want to send signals up and all of that. And I sat down with their people there and started talking about security. And what they told me is they said, the infrastructure isn't the cloud infrastructure isn't as mature. We're going to have the devices connect directly to our network. And I kind of looked at them and I said, okay, well, what security have you had? We haven't thought about that yet. So it's when you're dealing with other countries and especially when they're off doing their own engineering work, trying to set up those global policies and those global ideas around what that infrastructure should look like, without an overall strategy. And so I think where that comes full circle for us is trying to pull together what we consider to be standards, a full strategy around IoT, so that regardless of what we're doing or where we're doing it, everyone's doing it the same way and setting up the same security standards.
Thanks. And by the way, you can chime in at any time. Just raise your hand if you have a comment or a question, or yell if I don't see you, and I'll make sure we include you. So you all brought up a number of things, and I want to go to really one issue, and that's about the data. The data that you see collected, who owns it?
Well, we have a lot of data, both from the water heaters and from other companies, and we've asked that question. If you talk to the engineering team, they'll say, that's my data, I own it. If I talk to our legal team, they don't necessarily believe that it's necessarily our data. If you look at GDPR and what they're saying, they'll even take a different spin at whose data that is. You know, we like to have the data, at least from an analysis standpoint, but I think we're because of where GDPR is going, and you know, with the ability to say, if an end user says, hey, I want my data, I want my data off your system, we need the ability to go in and delete that. And so that's adding some additional layers of control that we need to put in, as well as some security. So I don't know if there's a clear answer.
So I'll take a spin at that. One of the first things I did when I found out that there's a lot of videotape being taken of customers or at our resorts, I worked with our legal team. Now I'm anti-data. There's no risk if you don't have any data. Okay, so my job is to eliminate risk or to reduce risk, and I do this through getting rid of data. So the first thing we had to do was a data retention policy. And so the legal team had to figure out what is it that we actually have to provide great service, but then provide compliance with laws, and then everything else we need to get rid of. And so we had this effort that going forward, we found out, and I asked why. Why do you have to have this videotape? First of all, why do you have to have the videotape in the resorts? There's a couple of different reasons, but no legal precedent of why. So no one could answer why. They just liked it. For example, another thing, if you go to a resort in another company, or at least in Mexico, you have to show your passport. Oftentimes, they will copy your passport and on a piece of paper and then put that into your folder, and then they keep that forever. And it's just secured in a flimsy hall locker closet, and I'm like, why do you need this piece of paper? What is the legal precedent? And then the data policy, our data policy says, why do you take this? Well, it's just to validate your name. Okay, why do you copy it? I feel comfortable. That's not a good enough reason. So eliminate it. And so we eliminated the copying of passports. I no longer have passports. So when you come to any of our resorts, we check your passport. Yeah, it matches the name. You're good to go. You put your passport back in your pocket, never to be taken out again. And then that's it. So when GDPR comes to me and says, you know, someone says, what data do you have on me? I don't. I have very, very little. And then will you eliminate it? I know exactly where I need to go to eliminate it. So I don't have reams and reams of data that I collect and collect and collect. That data privacy policy or the data policy, retention policy is very, very critical to me.
I was going to say, for my situation, there really is no clear answer, right? So for the homeowner in the process between when you list your home and you sell your home, they clearly own the data, but there is some contractual language between the agent and the owner about if the company is specifically requesting them to install IoT to appeal to a certain market. Now, on the residential side, where we're responsible for the home rentals or the apartment rentals, it's clearly the company that owns it. And we try as hard as possible to not integrate it within our internal network, but we do have data analytics on top of it to try to identify patterns and trends that we can actually use for future real estate transactions.
So in my business, we have a little bit varying complications, similar to David here, that we have videotapes, but we're required by law to keep a lot of those because once you enter a casino, you're really under surveillance no matter what. We have a separate surveillance department and such like that, and there's laws behind that. That data is used for legal purposes most times and such like that to investigate some type of fraud activity, et cetera. There's also controlled data that we have, which is part and parcel to the integral environment of when you guys actually go and make your deposits into our casino, and I use that euphemistically, those deposits, quote unquote, the government wants to tax, and so therefore they want to keep tight control over that data so they understand exactly what the tax is, and they get their maximum tax amount out of us. That's really what me and John here, he's awake, you awake? Okay, good. That's what we do. We can keep that data safe for the government. Beyond that, there's marketing data. There's tons of marketing data. And that marketing data in and of itself is used to bring you to the casino, to bring you to our place, attract you with some type of offer or something along those lines. And I am not a casino expert. I'll be one of the first person to tell you, live next to them. But the reality is they're some things are a bit of mystery or magic to me on how they attract people to deposit large sums of data on a table. The reality is when we look at the data, it depends on what data, and that data in and of itself is accessible only to certain individuals and groups. And even the data which is considered to be controlled, I do know that the state, in the end, if the entity that I work for becomes insolvent, they own the data. They may not be able to access it, but they own it in an insolvency case, from the point of view of backup tapes and such like that to go off-site. But IoT, still not a problem that is specific to this for me.
So let's go back to IoT for the security of IoT for a minute. We know that there are, let's just say, different standards involved, and some baked in and some not in terms of security. So in Washington, where I spend a lot of time, the new conversation about IoT, maybe not so new, is, hey, let's come up with some standards like the Underwriters Lab and move on from there. What do you see in terms of IoT that you think we could either standardize in some way, or perhaps that would stifle innovation in the IoT space? What do you think would work in your industries, and on a larger scale, what do you think we should do about it? Because clearly, we don't have an entire handle on what's going on.
Sure, I'll bite first. In the resort community, a very competitive community. There's a lot of great resorts out there, especially down in Mexico, Caribbean. And it's really hard to differentiate ourselves between us and someone else in our resorts. And we do this by providing superior customer service. So like Hilton, I don't know if you know this, and it's something that we grapple with. And I'm just, bear with me because I'm going down this road. The Bluetooth enablement of a room key. So you check in to your hotel room on your app, you don't go to the front desk, you go right to your room, and so we're playing with that. And so each one of our rooms, we have one hotel that's enabled with Bluetooth key, but then we're trying to figure out, well, how do we integrate blockchain? Well, at dinner last night, I talked to a gentleman that we were talking about blockchain and Bluetooth, and I think that's something that we need to figure out. It's how to differentiate ourselves, because our people that fly to Mexico, they're tired, maybe they have kids, they're cranky, they want to just go to the room, they don't want to stand 20 minutes on a line to check into a hotel, especially a 5-star hotel. You know, what a pain in the butt that is. And everything else that goes along with this, you know, and then how do you secure that data? How do you secure a key, and what happens to the key, and you know, can you use it at a different resort? I mean, if I'm the chief security officer, I can stifle innovation really quick. But my role is chief enablement officer. So the CIO, I don't work for the CIO. He and I are peers. He's the chief innovation officer. I'm the chief enablement officer. And I'm the one that has to enable his innovation. securely. And if we take that perspective, we'll be a little bit more successful. I think if I was the chief security officer and I was the guy who, Dr. No on everything, I wouldn't last long. They'd fire me right away. So I have to figure out how to do, like Dennis said yesterday, we're going to the cloud. And I said to Dennis, we're going there, whether you like it or not. We have to figure out how to get ahead of it and make it secure. So like in this Bluetooth and the blockchain, how do we get ahead of it so that we can really implement this and get it working in our businesses?
Sorry, I forgot the question.
Well, so for us, I mean, things are pretty standard from the technologies we're using for encryption and moving things between, whether it's a water heater or what it needs to be up to the cloud. Those are all pretty standard technologies. Where we see the biggest risk from an IoT standpoint is just the number of companies that are out there. When we look at a platform, I think the platform that we're on, I think we're the biggest company that this platform's using. And, it's a big risk for us because if that company decides to go under, we're not sure what we're going to do and where we're going to go. And if the technology that we have embedded in the water heaters, if that's proprietary to that particular vendor from a chipset perspective or whatever it might be, being able to swap out, may be difficult. Now, we've asked that question. They tell us, oh, yeah, absolutely you can. But, we haven't tried that. And so, the interoperability, I guess, across the various architectures and vendors, I think, is something to allow you to plug and play a little bit more, I think, would be something. Because I don't know how much they're creating proprietary technologies to be able to gather that information and send it up to the cloud.
So when we think of IoT, we tend to think of Alexa. Most people go, Alexa, Alexa. There's other things out there, but I'm a big proponent of that type of technology. I've always wanted the house where you can walk in and just tell, it knows your home, it turns the lights on. I think Kelly over there has a house like that, but that's just an aside. The reality is that technology is still a marketing machine for the various organizations that provide it. It is pulling data out of your environment, and they're utilizing it for their own marketing terms. I think part of this would be some type of insulation of the actual devices within a secure enclave would be something that would be very accomplishable with some type of firewall or some type of caching engine that maybe sat in front of these things that didn't allow the data to go out unless it was properly scrubbed and actually you understood what you were letting out. I believe some of the companies have made an attempt, some information securities companies have made an attempt at putting some sort of firewall like this in place. Like I believe Norton had Norton Core. I haven't seen it. Does anybody own that? Not a person. Okay. So suffice to say, standardization and or localization of the product and in some way caching it and causing that product to be thoroughly vetted before any data is released, I think is an important portion. Because when most people think of these things, they're looking at it. How does it interact with their environment? How does it make their life easier? How is it making your day a little brighter?
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with your points, because I'm thinking about it from the whole smart home perspective. I think we just have to be mindful of, are the vendors making products that are going to coordinate and cooperate with each other, right? So when I think about a smart home, right, we talk about the fridge, we're talking about the lights, we're talking about the stove, the appliances, et cetera. And some people are brand specific, and if you're brand specific, all of the brands, those will coordinate from the intelligence and security perspective. But if you like LG for your stove or XYZ for your refrigerator, they may not necessarily cooperate and interoperate. And so from that standpoint, we have an issue. But to answer your specific question, I'm personally am not in favor of like a UL standard, et cetera. I think we're still at a low maturity point. And I believe because we are so low and so immature, that to try to do standards right now would just be a waste of time, honestly.
I think a lot of people have said it's more of a Band-Aid to actually assuage consumer concerns as opposed to deal with the real issues there. By the way, anybody have any questions before we proceed? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so you guys are talking about, GDPR and maintaining confidentiality and privacy of people's information. But Dave, in your case, and Angelo, in your case, and Asher?
Nashira.
Okay, Nashira? Okay. You guys are collecting information from people through your systems, either whether I'm renting or staying in your hotel or taking a vacation. That information gets put on backup tapes. And while you may remove the videos and you may clean passport information, et cetera, in your online systems, how do you propose to go back and maintain the GDPR privacy acts and the information that you have collected that's stored on backup or on business continuity systems?
So we've actually done a little bit of that in my environment, and it comes down to the fact of how and where we store our actual pertinent data. That data is stored in an AS400, and anybody remember those things? It's a very legacy piece of equipment. It has a very rudimentary technology with regard to how we back up. It's really just a file copy. So when we actually address these things, we can actually do a search of old data and understand what's on there and cull the data or query and remove the data. Having said that, there's obviously legal requirements to the contrary that we need to keep some of that data in place, because that data is protected by New Jersey state law in my case.
I'll take a crack at that because that's a good question, and I'll talk to you a little bit about what we do. In the sense of people's information, like when you come and you make a reservation, you give us your email address. That's how we send you the confirmation. You make a payment to us, then we show, hey, he made a payment. Whenever you travel to our resorts, it's fully paid for before you come. It's all inclusive. You don't even need to bring your credit card because I won't accept a credit card when you come in the hotel. If you use a credit card, it's because you use it downtown. But in our data retention policy, we specify that after the completion of your resort experience, after 90 days, which is what the bank has to take. If there's any chargebacks or additional charges, we have to clear those. At 90 days, what we do is we go and we randomize the names in the email. So anything specific to a person. So if you traveled to our resort and you came in, you completed your travel 90 days later, and you came back and you said, hey, what data do you have on me? If it's past that 90-day mark I don't have anything on you because my policy says I randomize the data. Once that is written to a backup tape, it's only a randomized name. I cannot pinpoint you through an IP address or anything. No one can come to me and say, did this person come to your resort? If it's after that 90 days, I can't tell you. And there's no legal requirement for me to tell you that. So that's how that's why I want to eliminate, because of the backup issue. And these backup tapes, or the backup, we don't use tapes anymore. We back up to a cloud server. But then the old backups are overwritten. And so then there is nothing after 90 days.
So for my company, from a GDPR perspective, anything that we collect from the EU, we keep housed in the EU, right? So GDPR, while it is more extensive, we had the data directive of 96, 97, whatever that year was, right? And so they have a really good program already in Europe regarding data retention, data erasure, data eradication. And so for my company, we're good there because we've already and have always had that segregation.
Anybody else for now? So let's dig a little deeper on your IoT experiences. This is the part of the program where you have to confess. What problems have you found? I think, Angelo, you mentioned that there's all kinds of other activity you're not always aware of on the network. How have you dealt with those? And specifically, what future improvements do you need to make to avoid some obviously big problems coming, and not just GDPR ones, right?
So part of any network security program or computer security program, information security program, is knowing what is on your network, when it came on, and when it left your network. That's a notorious problem for anybody who is actually in this position. What I've done is implemented a number of tools to give me some idea of what's going on within and without the network. We have separated networks and such like that so that we are causing those devices in and of themselves to be more isolated. And so take, for instance, Johnson Controls or something along the lines of some older technology or even our advertising devices. They are actually isolated in their own simplistic networks so that the traffic is routed and inspected, and so that we're not allowing it to pass through. It doesn't negate the fact that someone could come in and plug into their local box or into a device, some type of other device that actually gives them some extended capability. But we've done some networking tools to further isolate devices and restrict what goes on those networks. Having said that, it's a constant struggle of actually seeing what happens in your network, where that data is flowing back and forth, and in the end, your daily struggle is punctuated by finding new and weird vulnerabilities that you didn't take into account the day before, such as the things like the fish tank. I'm always wary of the fish tank, of the HVAC controller, any pivot point that allows someone to enter the network. And thus, policy and procedure come into play, and also user awareness, employee awareness, getting them to know the importance of treating this network with kid gloves and understanding that what they put onto it, where they go, and how they do it is of extreme importance. And they need to understand that from both me telling them, because if I don't tell them, they won't know. And so I can't really blame them. I can't just throw a policy down there and say, you didn't adhere to that. I need to actually get that policy out there and let them know. But this is user behavior I'm dealing with, and that user behavior I'm trying to truncate with regard to their thought process of adding things to the network and such.
I would say my challenge has not been technical at all. I've dealt more with the cultural and the political challenges, right? So I mentioned that we have this tech startup in Silicon Valley, right? And we have all of these troves of data that they want to try to find a way to analyze, to monetize the data. And then I have my very conservative legal team who traditionally is used to partnering with security to stop things, right? And so to Dave's point, I have had to figure out and coach my team how we become the business enabler, to have legal's perspective that there is risk, but to provide guidance to my, millennials techs over in California who could care less about security or privacy. It's what do we need to do with this data? How can we access it? How can we monetize this for the company? So again, for me, it's been more political and cultural and less technical. The big IoT issue that we've run into, which I'm not sure if we have an exact answer yet, is we took a look at their existing architecture and what we had implemented, and we're very comfortable from a security standpoint what we had. But then we started to ask the question, okay, well, what happens if a new hack comes out, a new vulnerability is identified in that particular chip or the software that was delivered or whatever it might be? What do we do then? I mean, we've got 500,000 water heaters that are out in homes that we just realized have a vulnerability in them. Do we have the ability to push something down? If it's at a chip level, absolutely not. I mean, that's we'd have to actually have a plumber go out and take apart the water heater and replace what they have. I don't think we don't know the answer yet. That's where we're struggling with that and figuring out how do we do that. Now, the push idea I think works in some cases, but not for everything that we have. The other issue we have, and one we haven't really hit yet, is on the OT side. So we are pretty heavily looking at IIoT, and we have probably six plants across the U.S., all different ages, with lots of different PLCs in each of these plants, different technologies. Some are really old. We talked about XP machines. We have
XP machines running PLCs all over the plants. And the standards and technologies of those PLCs are different everywhere. And for us to try to create or create an IoT standard to sit on top of all these different technologies has really been a challenge. And it's a, probably a $20 to $30 million project to actually go in and try to update some of these to get them to a place where we can start looking across plants rather than at each individual plant.
I'll go back. Do many of you, are you familiar with the SANS Top 20? Who's familiar with the SANS Top 20? Do you know what, can anybody tell me what number 1 is?
Inventory.
Inventory. A real-time inventory of your equipment on your network. One of the things I learned at Exelon, and that they were really good about, is that if you plugged in something that didn't belong to them, they knew about it, okay? And they were Johnny on the spot. The worst thing you can, as you can imagine, if there's a nuclear power plant, someone brings in his home laptop, plugs it into the network, and lets his 15-year-old kid connect to the internet and play a game. Would that concern you? Yes. Of course you would. Well, it would concern you anywhere. When I remember I said about in the resort, when I first went out there, all 3 networks were converged. The first thing I did was unconverge and air gap the building management system. And then I separated the Wi-Fi, the customer Wi-Fi, from the actual network that the hotel ran on. Air gapping. And the reason why I found this out is that I went into one of the plants, the power plant for the hotel, and there was a Wi-Fi access point, and guys were playing games. And they were doing it on my building management system. And I said, what are you doing? And what were they playing? World of Warcraft. My kid plays it. It's not what you have on your building management system and all your IoT devices. It's just not that, that's just not smart. You have to know what's on your network in a real time. So that's my challenge, is to identify in a real-time manner those devices that belong to me or don't belong to me, and whether or not I give them an IP address. That's something that we struggle with on a daily basis.
Any questions from you before we continue? Oh, you get a second question.
So all of you have brought up building management systems and their role in cyber. And so what are you doing to, you've obviously looked at building management from a cyber perspective. What are you doing to protect them? Because I've heard PLCs of varying legacy statuses and XP machines. I've heard guys playing games with their own Wi-Fi access point. So how are you kind of thematically, what are you doing? I heard air gap, but if someone's adding a Wi-Fi access point, that eliminated that. But thematically, what are you thinking about from a building management system, isolating it, securing it, kind of packaging it like you would in IT?
So for us, the PLCs and the plants, they are on their own network that is entirely separated from everything else. And that was really insisted upon, not only by security, but by plant management. They didn't want anything that could potentially jump from our office network onto their plant network to potentially affect the robots that are all running. And for the machines that are out there running, applications that were custom developed that will only run on NT, we've basically just firewalled all that off so that really nothing can get to that. We'd love to eventually be able to replace that, but it's a matter of money and dollars, and so sometimes the business just says, oh, just keep what you're doing as long as that's safe. And so by separating that, we've at least protected the plants to a degree.
I can concur. I mean, VLANing is a strong thing that allows us to actually isolate those machines in those networks. We have devices in my network that are inherently legacy. We're literally, at some points, behind the veneer you see of the wonderful, lovely place like this, There's probably machines with a hard drive taped into them so that they can continue to run. So the reality is what you see is generally the lipstick, and then behind the scenes is the pig. In and of itself, that isolation, we're identifying devices more so that we understand what they do, how they do it, and further, it's again, a daily struggle. What's on my network? What's it doing? Where's it talking to? And what's it need to do? These are the things that we daily struggle with, and it becomes more clear over time what the device does, and then you ask the question, do we need it? Does it need to be there? Is the data it's collecting important? And then you back it off from there.
I think we have a quick question.
Anybody, just color this, how do lead initiatives impact budgets? Is there anything that impact, obviously, your world as far as lead certifications?
So for me, no, because again, it's not my direct responsibility because it's the owner, renter, et cetera. So most of my triage, protection, or quote unquote budget, or efforts rather, would be towards education and awareness. For the agents, for the building and the property owners, saying, hey, as you start to introduce smart devices within homes, kitchens, et cetera, please make sure the consumer is aware of whatever the issues may happen to be. So the first quarter, we've invested a lot for agent education and awareness, not necessarily anything technical, because again, it's not on my company's network.
I'm going to put a shameless plug in for the security roundtable that I'm going to run later on today about security versus risk and address the budget thing. My budget, it's really interesting, and it's a long story, so I'm going to tell it there. But the short story is that I don't go in for budget. I go in and I present to the board, here's the risk, here's how much it's going to take to reduce your risk by this much, here's how much it takes to reduce it by this much, and here's how much it takes to reduce it by this much. Here's your impact on EBITDA. So if you don't know what EBITDA is, it's that all money we get to put in our pocket after taxes and expenses. That's the terms that they work in. So I tell them, you know, here's the impact on your EBITDA if you don't do this, and the probability that that will happen. And it's their risk appetite. So usually when I go in and I present that way, they just write a check and say, I'm willing to reduce it this much. And that's how much I get. So I don't go in with a fixed cost.
Hi, Kelly Isakoff. So I actually had a question about something that you'd spoken about, Dave, which was identifying unknown devices that come on and off your network. This is something that is a big issue for a lot of companies, particularly smaller companies that are more open and collaborative in nature, like my company. So my question is, what are some of the different vendors that you guys are looking at or have implemented, different types of network access control vendors that you utilize, if you wouldn't mind sharing?
I'm kind of vendor agnostic, but I will tell you some of the technology that we use on some of our devices. And as the Chief Enablement Officer, I'm looking for those that can accept a certificate. And so ours is a certificate-based environment. So we do public key, private key certificates. We generate them, we put it on the device. The device then registers on the network, and if it has a current certificate and it's not expired, then it gets an IP address. And everything else is blocked. So my default is deny, and that goes for laptops. So the certificates are good on corporate laptops to get on the corporate network, and I can expire that certificate or revoke it at any time. So if I know someone is leaving this afternoon because they're being walked out the door, I can revoke that certificate. Their laptop can't get on the corporate network, but it can get on the guest Wi-Fi, which is a separate pipe going out. But they can't get access to corporate resources. So that's the technology I'm currently using. I think that's going to mature. There's a lot of people, there are a lot of smart people here in this room, and I think there's some of these vendors will come out with something that's much, much better than that. I'm looking for the easy button all the time.
I'm using a number of different tools, from a vulnerability, passive vulnerability scanning, to network access controls, network access like a true NAC, and in addition to that, utilizing on-box controls like a MDM on all the devices that can actually take that. And we have been utilizing this set of technologies as of late. To be entirely frank, we're a very legacy organization, as I've said, and MFA was a new concept to these guys. So the reality is, it's a struggle sometimes to get the new technology in place so they understand the risk, and it's part of the user education, is executive user education.
Yeah, we don't have software that we're doing it. We're somewhat behind the ball from that regard, but what we do is, for us, it's a little bit more of a hardware type view, right? We don't have LAN cables just laying around where someone can just go plug something in. Everything's protected for the offices. Everything's back underneath, and then we have the guest Wi-Fi. We have the company Wi-Fi. We do not share the Wi-Fi passwords anywhere. We used to do that. I used to walk in and the company Wi-Fi password was sitting up on a whiteboard somewhere, and I was like, we can't do that. And so now IT is the only one who knows the password. They have to go to a PC or a phone or whatever and enter it themselves. But the guest Wi-Fi is open, so we're trying to make it easy to go other routes and not plug it into our network.
Similar for us, we are NAC enabled. Our corporate Wi-Fi is completely segregated from the internal corporate network, and then there's also a guest Wi-Fi as well. So it's 3 different layers for us.
Okay, we only have a couple minutes left, so let's try to sum up a little. Basically, what we heard today is there are ways to deal with the IoT challenge. They range from having to deal with scalable technologies to educating your board to educating your workforce. It's a challenge partially because of the amount of publicity that some of IoT has received, and I think some of the inaccuracies that we see out there in the descriptions of it. If you had one piece of advice for somebody who just got IoT in their portfolio today as they walked into the room, give them one sentence of advice.
Embrace it. And then fix it.
Understand how it enables your business and what are the specific risks for your area, and deal with the risk, not necessarily the technology.
Back to my point of understanding the data flow, and why you need it.
I would say just understand the value you're going to get from it, because in many cases it's not the shiny gold star that everyone thinks it's going to be, and it may not add as much value as you think.
Okay, so with that, if you could join me in thanking our panel for their help this morning.